You can't fix a dead engine with nostalgia, old man. The words cut clean through the hot afternoon air, sharp with the kind of confidence that hadn't yet been tested by failure, and a few of the younger technicians chuckled under their breath as the helicopter sat silent on the tarmac behind him, its rotor blades sagging in the heat like something tired of pretending to be alive. Logan Pierce stood with his hands on his hips, grease streaked across his gloves, staring at the dormant machine as if willing it to obey him, but the aircraft gave him nothing in return, just a hollow stillness that made the entire base feel like it was holding its breath, and beyond the safety line a small cluster of officers and invited guests shifted uncomfortably, checking watches, glancing toward the control tower where the scheduled demonstration was already slipping behind by nearly 20 minutes. Laptops glowed on portable tables, screens filled with green diagnostics that insisted everything was fine. Every system nominal, every sensor online, a perfect digital lie that only made the silence of the engine more humiliating, because if nothing was wrong then why wouldn't it start? Logan exhaled hard and turned, catching sight of the old man standing just outside the circle of activity, hands tucked into the pockets of a faded field jacket that had long since lost its original color, his posture relaxed but unmoving, like he had all the time in the world while everyone else was running out of it, and that alone was enough to irritate him. "This area is restricted," Logan said, voice raised just enough to be heard by the others, projecting authority he needed more than he owned. "We've got this handled." But the old man didn't respond, didn't argue, didn't even look offended, his pale eyes fixed instead on the helicopter, not the instruments or the panels, but the machine itself, as if he were listening for something no one else could hear. The faint wind carried across the runway, brushing past the rotor blades with a low whisper, and for a brief moment it almost sounded like the echo of something that used to move, something that used to work, but now refused to. Logan followed his gaze, then shook his head, annoyed at himself for even pausing. "Look," he added, sharper now, "we've got top-tier diagnostics on this platform, full system integration, real-time analysis, we don't need guesswork," and that earned a few nods from the team. Small reassurances passed between them like lifelines, because they all knew the truth sitting in front of them was something their tools couldn't explain. The old man finally shifted, just slightly, stepping closer by a foot or two, not crossing any boundary, just enough to change the angle of his view. And when he spoke his voice was low, rough with age but steady. "You're reading it," he said, almost to himself, "but you're not hearing it," and the words hung there for a second, confusing in their simplicity, before Logan let out a short, humorless laugh. "Yeah, that's not how this works," he replied, turning back toward the helicopter with a dismissive wave, but something about the way the old man had said it lingered, not loud, not forceful, just certain. And that certainty clashed hard against the uncertainty everyone else was trying to ignore. A gust of wind rolled across the tarmac again, carrying the dry scent of heated metal and fuel, and somewhere deep inside the silent engine, there was a faint, almost imperceptible tick, the kind of sound you wouldn't notice unless you were listening for it, unless you knew what it meant, and the old man's eyes narrowed just a fraction as he focused on that sound while the rest of the team kept staring at screens that insisted nothing was wrong at all. The ticking sound faded as quickly as it had appeared, swallowed by the hum of idle equipment and the restless shifting of boots against sun-baked concrete, but the silence that followed felt heavier than before, as if the helicopter itself was refusing to be ignored any longer. Logan Pierce dragged a hand across his face, leaving a streak of grease along his jaw as he turned back toward the diagnostic table, his patience thinning with every passing second. "Run it again," he snapped, and one of the technicians immediately tapped at the keyboard, pulling up the same clean cascade of green indicators that had been mocking them for the past hour. Fuel pressure within tolerance, ignition sequence ready, electrical pathway stable, everything exactly where it should be, everything except the one thing that mattered. Logan leaned in, scanning the data as if something might suddenly change out of sheer pressure, but it did not, and the longer he stared the more it felt like the system was quietly daring him to admit it had no answers. Behind him, the old man had not moved much, only shifted his weight slightly, his gaze still fixed on the helicopter in a way that made it seem less like a machine and more like a conversation he was trying to finish. A pair of junior technicians whispered to each other near the landing skid, glancing back at him with faint amusement, their voices low but not low enough to hide the tone. "Probably thinks he can fix it with a wrench and a story," one of them muttered, and the other let out a quick laugh before straightening when Logan shot them a look. The air was getting hotter, the kind of dry heat that made the metal surfaces shimmer and the smell of warmed fuel hang heavier in the lungs, and somewhere off to the side an officer checked his watch again. then looked toward the control tower with a tight expression that said the delay was no longer acceptable. "We do not have time for this," Logan said under his breath, though it came out louder than he intended, and he stepped back toward the helicopter, his boots echoing softly against the tarmac as he approached the engine housing, placing a hand against the panel as if he could feel the answer through it, but all he felt was heat and stillness. He glanced over his shoulder and caught the old man watching him, not with judgment, not with impatience, just with a quiet attention that made the moment feel strangely exposed, like someone else had already seen the outcome before he had even admitted the problem. "If you have something useful to say," Logan called out, half turning, his voice edged with frustration. Now would be the time, and a few heads turned, curious to see if the old man would finally speak, but instead of stepping forward or raising his voice, he simply tilted his head slightly, listening again, and after a second he asked, calm and steady, "When did it last run right?" The question landing in the middle of the tension like something simple enough to be ignored, yet too precise to dismiss entirely. Logan frowned, caught off guard by how direct it was, and for a moment he did not answer, because the truth was he did not know, not exactly, and that realization sat heavier than any malfunction warning ever could, because it meant they had been trying to fix something they did not fully understand from the start, and the helicopter remained there in front of them, quiet, waiting, as if it had already decided who it was willing to listen to and who it was not. Logan hesitated just long enough for the silence to notice, and that was all it took for the moment to shift in a way he could not control, because the question had not been complicated, it had not been technical, and yet it had landed in the exact place his data could not reach. He straightened slightly, folding his arms as if posture alone could rebuild authority. "It passed inspection 48 hours ago," he said, his voice firm but lacking the certainty it had carried earlier, and the old man gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, not as agreement, but as if placing that detail somewhere in a larger picture only he could see. The wind brushed across the tarmac again, lighter this time, carrying a faint metallic scent that seemed to cling to the edges of the aircraft, and the old man took a slow step closer, stopping just short of the engine housing, his eyes tracing along the seams of the panels, the bolts, the subtle lines where parts met with precision that had once been perfect. Logan watched him now, not openly challenging, but no longer dismissing either, because there was something unsettling about the way the man moved, not like someone guessing, but like someone remembering. "You said everything reads clean," the old man murmured, his voice low enough that only those nearest could hear, and Logan gave a short nod. "All systems are within tolerance," he replied, gesturing back toward the glowing screens as if they were witnesses that could speak for him. And for a moment neither of them said anything more, the distance between data and instinct hanging in the air like heat rising off the runway. One of the junior technicians shifted nearby, glancing between them with a hint of impatience, as if waiting for this quiet exchange to end so the real work could continue, but the old man did not rush, did not reach for a tool, did not ask for permission. He simply listened again, head slightly tilted, eyes narrowed just enough to focus on something beneath the surface. A faint clicking sound came again, irregular, almost too soft to register, and this time Logan heard it too, just barely, a subtle interruption in the stillness that had not shown up on any screen, and he frowned, stepping closer without realizing he was mirroring the old man's movement. "That is not supposed to be there," the old man said, more to the machine than to anyone else, and Logan felt a flicker of irritation rise again, not because the statement was wrong, but because it was right in a way he could not explain. If there was a fault like that, it would show up, he insisted, though his voice had lost its earlier edge, and the old man finally looked at him directly, not challenging, not correcting, just meeting his gaze with a calm that carried weight without force. "Only if the system knows it is a fault," he said, and that single sentence seemed to settle over the group like a shadow, quiet but undeniable. Logan glanced back at the helicopter, then at the data, then back again, caught between two versions of the same reality, one measured and verified, the other heard and felt, and for the first time since the engine had refused to start, he did not immediately dismiss the possibility that the problem was not hidden in the numbers, but in something the numbers had never been designed to see. While the helicopter remained there in front of them, silent, patient, as if waiting for someone to finally understand the language it was speaking. The faint clicking came again, just enough to be noticed now that silence had sharpened everyone's attention, and Logan felt it more than heard it, a subtle irregularity that slipped between the certainty of the data and the reality in front of him. But before he could respond, one of the younger technicians stepped forward with a smirk, breaking the tension with a dismissive chuckle. "It is thermal expansion," he said quickly, eager to reassert control. Metal contracts and expands, it happens. And a few others nodded, relieved to have an explanation that fit inside the boundaries of what they understood, even if it did not solve anything. Logan seized onto it, turning back toward the old man with a thin, controlled smile that did not quite hide the strain behind it. "See, we already accounted for that," he said, gesturing toward the helicopter as if the machine itself would agree with him. "This is not guesswork, we do not chase ghosts," and the words carried more edge now, not just directed outward but inward, as if he needed to hear them as much as anyone else. The old man did not react to the tone, did not defend his observation, he simply shifted his gaze downward toward the lower section of the engine housing, following a line of rivets and seams with a quiet focus that seemed to ignore the conversation entirely, and that absence of reaction only made Logan's irritation sharpen. "You keep listening to it like it is going to talk back," Logan added, louder this time, drawing a few more eyes from the surrounding crew and even a couple of officers beyond the perimeter. "But this is not some old field repair. This is a modern system. Everything it needs to say is already right there." He pointed back toward the diagnostic table again, toward the glowing screens that had become their only source of certainty. "If there was a problem, we would see it," and the statement landed with a firmness that sounded convincing, at least on the surface. One of the technicians leaned against a tool cart, arms crossed, his gaze drifting toward the old man's jacket, lingering on the worn leather pouch hanging at his side, its surface creased and darkened by years of use, the stitching slightly frayed along the edges, and he let out a quiet laugh. "What have you got in there anyway?" he asked, nodding toward it. "Some kind of lucky charm," and a few of the others smirked, the tension easing just enough for mockery to return, because it was easier to laugh than to admit they were stuck. The old man's hand moved almost unconsciously to the pouch, resting against it for a moment, not protective, not defensive, just familiar, like touching something that had been part of him for longer than most of the people here had been alive, and for a brief second his expression shifted, not visibly to most, but enough that Logan caught it, a flicker of something deeper than irritation or patience, something tied to memory rather than the present. "We are done here," Logan said abruptly, turning away from him as if closing the conversation by force. "We are not opening anything that is not flagged by the system." And that was the line, the rule that separated controlled procedure from uncertainty, the one thing holding the team together in the absence of answers, because breaking it would mean admitting they were no longer in control. The old man lifted his eyes again, looking not at Logan this time but at the panel just beneath the exhaust housing, a small section of metal that appeared perfectly aligned, perfectly sealed, just another piece of a machine that claimed to be flawless, and in a quiet voice that did not rise above the hum of the air he said, "It is not supposed to sound like that," and the certainty in that sentence did not come from theory or guesswork, it came from something older, something earned, and for a moment the laughter faded, replaced by a silence that felt less like doubt and more like the edge of realization, as if the machine had already told the truth and only one person on that runway had been willing to hear it. The words lingered in the air longer than they should have, not because they were loud, but because they were certain, and certainty had become rare on that runway, and before anyone could respond the old man's thumb brushed lightly across the worn edge of the leather pouch at his side, a small, almost absent motion that seemed to anchor him in something far removed from the heat and pressure of the present, and for a fleeting second his gaze shifted, not outward but inward, as if the silent helicopter in front of him had opened a door that led somewhere else entirely. The hum of idle equipment faded, replaced by the memory of a different kind of sound, deeper, heavier, the steady thrum of rotor blades cutting through thick air, the kind of rhythm that settled into your bones and told you everything you needed to know if you were willing to listen, and in that memory the air was heavier too, not with heat from the sun but with moisture that clung to everything, the smell of fuel. Sharper, mixed with the scent of oil and metal pushed far past comfort, and the machine beneath his hands was not silent then, it was alive but failing, its rhythm broken in a way no instrument could fully explain, only felt. His younger hands had moved without hesitation, tracing along panels and seams, not searching for what the system would flag, but for what the machine itself was trying to say. And there had been a moment then, just like now, when everything else had fallen away, when the noise, the pressure, the urgency had narrowed into a single detail that did not belong, a slight misalignment, a subtle shift that no manual would call a fault, and yet it was enough to change everything. The memory passed through him like a quiet current, not overwhelming, not dramatic, just present, and when his focus returned to the runway the helicopter in front of him no longer looked unfamiliar or complex, it looked the same as it always had, a machine built by people, maintained by people, and misunderstood by people who trusted what they could see more than what they could sense. Behind him, the technicians were still talking, their voices carrying a mix of frustration and forced confidence, one of them tapping the side of a tablet as if the act itself might produce a different answer, while Logan stood slightly apart now, his attention divided between the data he trusted and the sound he could no longer ignore. The old man's hand slipped into the pouch and for a moment it seemed like he might pull something out. But instead his fingers simply rested there, feeling the familiar shapes inside, tools worn smooth by time, edges rounded not by neglect but by use, and that quiet contact was enough to steady the line between past and present. He stepped closer to the helicopter, closing the remaining distance without asking, without announcing it, his movement slow but deliberate, and as he reached the side of the engine housing he paused, listening again, not for volume, not for pattern, but for intention, for the way the machine held itself even in stillness, and there it was, that same faint irregularity, not loud enough to demand attention, but too consistent to be dismissed. It shifted, he said softly, almost to himself, his eyes settling on a small section of paneling just beneath the exhaust line, a place no one had touched because there had been no reason to, a place the system had declared perfect, and yet to him it stood out the same way it had all those years ago, not because it was broken, but because it was just slightly wrong. And that difference, invisible to numbers, undeniable to experience, was where the truth had been waiting all along. Logan followed the old man's gaze, his eyes narrowing as they settled on the same section of paneling, a smooth, unremarkable surface that had passed every inspection without question, and for a moment he said nothing, because there was nothing obvious to argue against, no visible defect, no data point flashing red to support his authority. That panel is sealed and aligned within factory tolerance, he said finally, his voice measured, controlled, but lacking the earlier certainty that had carried him through the first hour of failure, and the old man gave a small nod as if he had expected that answer all along. It is within tolerance, he repeated quietly, his hand lifting just enough to hover near the metal without touching it, but it is not where it used to be, and the distinction was subtle, almost intangible, yet it carried a weight that made Logan's jaw tighten. One of the technicians stepped closer, frowning as he crouched to inspect the area, running a gloved hand along the seam, feeling for any irregularity, but his expression only hardened with confusion. It is flush, he said, standing back up, no deviation, no looseness, nothing out of spec, and a few others leaned in, confirming the same thing, each reinforcing the conclusion they needed to hold on to. Logan exhaled slowly, turning back toward the old man. You are basing this on sound, he said, not quite a question, not quite an accusation, and the old man met his gaze with that same steady calm. On pattern, he replied, on rhythm, on what it should feel like even when it is quiet, and the word settled into the space between them, difficult to challenge because they did not belong to the same language as the data Logan relied on. The heat shimmered across the runway, distorting the edges of the aircraft just enough to make everything feel slightly unreal, and in that distortion Logan found himself looking again at the panel, not through the lens of numbers, but through the possibility that something could be wrong without announcing itself. Even if you are right, Logan said, his voice lower now, more cautious, we do not open sealed components without a confirmed fault. That is protocol, and the word protocol landed heavily, a boundary he could not cross without consequence, a rule that protected order even when it limited action. The old man's hand lowered slowly, resting again against the leather pouch, and for a second it seemed like he might step back, accept the limitation. Let the system continue its silent standoff with the machine, but instead he looked once more at the helicopter, his eyes tracing the line of the panel as if committing it to memory, and then he spoke, not louder, not sharper, just clearer. If you wait for it to tell you in numbers, it will wait longer than you can afford, and that was not a challenge, not a demand, just a statement placed carefully into the tension that had been building since the engine first refused to start. Behind them, a distant voice called out from the edge of the tarmac, a reminder that time was slipping, that expectations were closing in, and Logan felt it press against him from all sides, the data, the silence, the eyes watching, the weight of responsibility tightening around a problem that refused to reveal itself, and in that narrowing space he looked once more at the panel, at the place where everything appeared perfect and yet something felt undeniably off, and for the first time since the situation began, he did not immediately turn away. Owen Carter had been standing just behind the second row of technicians, quiet, unnoticed, the way the youngest ones often were, but his eyes had not left the old man since the moment he stepped onto the tarmac, because there was something about him that did not fit the pattern Owen had learned to trust. not in the way he dressed, not in the way he spoke, but in the way he did not react when everyone else did. And that kind of stillness was not confusion, it was control. He shifted his weight slightly, glancing from Logan to the panel and back again, replaying the last few minutes in his head, the question about when it last ran right, the way the old man had listened instead of argued, the way he had pointed to something no one else had even considered, and a quiet unease settled deeper in his chest, the kind that did not come from doubt, but from recognition. He stepped back slowly, careful not to draw attention, his hand slipping into his pocket as he turned away from the group, moving toward the edge of the tarmac where the noise of the bass softened just enough to think clearly, and once he was far enough, he pulled out his phone, hesitating for only a second before scrolling through a list of contacts he rarely used. Stopping on a number that had been given to him during orientation with the kind of emphasis that meant it mattered more than it seemed, he pressed call, lifting the phone to his ear as it rang once, twice, and then a voice answered, crisp and direct, Command Office, and Owen straightened instinctively even though no one could see him. Specialist Carter, maintenance detail on runway 3, he said quickly, keeping his voice low. I need to confirm a call order. There was a brief pause on the other end, the sound of keys tapping. Go ahead, the voice replied, and Owen swallowed, choosing his words carefully. There is a civilian on site, older male, no visible credentials, but he said he was sent by command. I need to verify if that is accurate. Another pause, longer this time, and Owen could hear the shift in attention, the subtle change in tone that meant the question had just become important. Name, the voice asked, sharper now, and Owen glanced back toward the tarmac. Watching the old man standing near the helicopter, still focused, still unmoved by the tension around him, he did not say, Owen admitted, then added, but I can get it, do it. The voice responded immediately. Owen ended the call and moved back toward the group, his pace steady but purposeful, weaving through the technicians until he reached the old man's side, close enough to speak without drawing attention. Sir, he said quietly, respectful without overplaying it, I need your name for verification. The old man looked at him, not surprised, not annoyed, just acknowledging the question as if it had been expected all along, and after a brief moment he answered, Walter Creed. The name simple, unadorned, but it carried a weight Owen could not explain. He nodded once and stepped back again, already dialing, and when the line picked up this time he spoke without hesitation, name is Walter Creed, and on the other end there was no immediate response, just a silence that stretched a second too long, then two, and when the voice finally returned it was different, lower, tighter, stand by. The line did not disconnect, but Owen could hear movement now, muffled voices, something being relayed, something escalating, and as he stood there with the phone pressed to his ear, the noise of the runway seemed to fade again, replaced by a growing sense that whatever was about to happen next had already been set in motion long before any of them realized it, and behind him the helicopter remained still, waiting, as if it too understood that the moment had just changed. The silence on Owen's phone ended not with an answer, but with a shift in atmosphere that reached the runway before any words did, a subtle tightening that moved through the chain of command like a ripple under still water, and across the tarmac a black staff vehicle rolled to a controlled stop near the perimeter, its engine cutting clean as the door opened with deliberate precision. Conversation around the helicopter thinned, not all at once, but enough that the change could be felt, and Logan turned slightly, his eyes narrowing as he watched a tall figure step out, uniform crisp, posture unmistakable, the kind of presence that did not need to raise its voice to command attention. Brigadier General Ethan Cross did not look toward the technicians first, did not ask for a report, did not acknowledge the delay or the growing tension. Instead his gaze moved directly to the old man standing beside the silent aircraft, and for a brief moment the entire scene seemed to align around that single line of sight. Owen lowered his phone slowly, the call still connected but forgotten, and nearby one of the officers straightened instinctively, signaling to the others without a word, and within seconds the loose formation of personnel shifted into something more structured, more aware, as if the weight of rank had quietly settled over them. Logan stepped forward, preparing to explain, to regain control of the narrative before it slipped completely. Sir, we are currently diagnosing a... But the general lifted a hand, not sharply, not dismissively, just enough to stop the words before they formed, and the interruption landed heavier than any raised voice could have. His attention remained fixed on Walter Creed, and when he spoke, his tone was calm, measured, carrying none of the urgency that had filled the runway moments before. You took your time, he said, and there was no accusation in it, only recognition. Walter's expression did not change, but there was a slight shift in his posture, something almost like acknowledgement. "Had to listen first," he replied, his voice steady, and the exchange was brief, quiet, yet it carried a familiarity that did not belong to strangers. Logan felt the ground beneath the situation shift again, more noticeably this time, and he glanced between them, the pieces no longer fitting the way they had before. "Sir," he began again, more cautiously, "the system is showing no faults. We cannot justify opening." "You are not going to justify it," the general said, cutting in gently but completely, his eyes still on Walter. "He is," and with that single sentence the structure Logan had been holding onto loosened its grip. A few of the technicians exchanged glances, uncertainty replacing the earlier confidence, while others looked back at Walter with a different kind of attention now, not dismissive, not mocking, but searching. The general took a step closer, stopping just beside Walter without crowding him, his presence firm but not imposing, and for a moment he said nothing more, as if the decision had already been made before he arrived. The heat, the pressure, the noise of expectation all seemed to pull back slightly, leaving a quiet space around the helicopter where only two things mattered, the machine that refused to start and the man who had been brought in to understand why. And as Logan stood there, caught between protocol and authority, between data and something he could not quantify, he realized that whatever happened next was no longer his to control. While the helicopter remained still, patient, as if it had been waiting for this exact moment all along. Walter Cree did not rush, did not look to the general for permission again, because it had already been given, and instead he stepped closer to the engine housing with the same quiet certainty he had carried from the beginning, his hand moving to the panel beneath the exhaust line as he studied it one last time, not searching, not guessing, but confirming what he already knew. The tarmac fell into a deeper silence, conversations fading completely now, every set of eyes fixed on a part of the aircraft that moments ago had meant nothing to them, and Logan stood just behind the line, arms no longer crossed, no longer certain where to place himself in a situation that had slipped beyond his control. Walter reached into the leather pouch and drew out a small, worn wrench, its edges softened by years of use, its surface dull but clean, a tool that did not belong in a modern diagnostic kit and yet fit perfectly in his hand, and without hesitation he knelt slightly, placing the wrench against a set of fasteners along the panel, loosening them with slow, deliberate movements that made no unnecessary sound. The panel came free without resistance, revealing a narrow space beneath, not complex, not dramatic, just a junction where components met in quiet precision. And Walter leaned in just enough to see what he needed, his fingers tracing along a connection point where alignment mattered more than appearance, where a fraction of an inch could change the entire behavior of the system. He adjusted it carefully, not forcing it, not correcting it as if it were broken, but guiding it back into place as if returning something to where it had always intended to be. And then he paused, listening again, his head tilted slightly as the faint irregularity shifted, softened, and finally disappeared into the background hum of stillness. He secured the panel with the same steady motion, tightening each fastener by feel rather than measurement, his hand knowing the exact point where resistance became balance, and when he finished he stood, stepping back without looking at anyone, his attention still on the machine as if waiting for it to answer. For a moment nothing happened, the silence stretching just long enough to test every expectation on the runway. And then Walter nodded once, a small, almost invisible gesture. "Try it," he said, his voice calm, and Logan hesitated only a fraction of a second before turning to the nearest technician. "Run ignition." The command carried differently now, less certain, more hopeful, and the technician moved quickly, fingers steady as he initiated the sequence. The first sound was subtle, a low intake of air that deepened into a rising tone, and then the engine caught, not violently, not abruptly, but smoothly, confidently, the kind of ignition that felt right even before it could be measured. And within seconds the rotor began to turn, slow at first, then building, the steady rhythm filling the air with a presence that replaced the earlier silence entirely. The heat shifted with it, the smell of fuel blending into motion, and the entire tarmac seemed to come back to life in response. No one spoke. Not immediately, because there was nothing to say that would not diminish what had just happened, and Logan stood there watching the aircraft, then looking at the panel, then at Walter, the realization settling in without resistance, that the difference between failure and function had not been hidden in complexity, but in something simpler, something quieter, something he had not been trained to trust. Beside him, Brigadier General Cross remained still, his gaze steady on Walter, and after a moment he gave a small, precise nod, not applause, not announcement, just recognition. and that single gesture carried through the group more clearly than any words could have, shifting the atmosphere from tension to something else entirely, something closer to respect, as the helicopter continued to run, no longer silent, no longer waiting, and the truth of what had happened settled over the runway in a quiet that needed no explanation.